We can start.
Okay. So, hello, good evening, everyone. And I am very happy to welcome you all back to the new cycle of C Conversations. Just to give a brief background for those who might be attending this event for the first time, C Conversations is an initiative of C City, which is the public outreach division program of the School of Environment and Architecture, which is based in Mumbai. And it is a platform which is meant for cultural dialogue with a range of design and allied cultural disciplines. We call a range of speakers on this platform to share their ideas and expand our own kind of radius of how we think about architecture and design. It's a fortnightly series, and we have in the last two cycles of where we have been locked down, we took the advantage of the online medium to curate these series around bringing people from all kinds of places beyond our geographical reach. One of the series was on South Asian architecture, where we connected with scholars and practitioners who are expanding and helped us understand the architectural environment in the South Asian region. In the last semester, our series was called Many Languages, Many Architectures, where we were looking at the aspect of visual culture and drawing and different languages of thinking in architecture. And continuing that idea of curated talks, this semester we decided to bring the dimension of building agency. And before I elaborate upon this semester's theme, let me introduce myself. I'm Anuj Daga, and I'm an assistant professor at the School of Environment and Architecture. And I'm very happy to kind of also share that this series of fortnight lectures at C City has been supported by Urban Center Mumbai. And just to give a brief background, Urban Center Mumbai is a part of the Urban Center Trust, which is a young non-profit organization established in 2020 by city practitioners. It aims to become a node for dialogue, for ideating, for deliberation, to carry out research, and to communicate on urban planning, urban design, urban conservation, and sustainable urban development in the city between communities, stakeholders, and various agencies. And I think we are very privileged to have them partner with us for this very idea of building agency. And now, to just give a brief background of what were our thoughts behind this set of talks. So on 16th March 2020, that is last year, the Supreme Court of India had made an interpretation of the Architects Act of 1972 that shook the legislative identity of architects in the country. So, as we know, or some of us may know, that the Act had prohibited anyone who is not registered by the Council of Architecture, and so not qualified as an architect technically, to use the title of the architect. Now, for years, this prohibition was interpreted as a prohibition on participating in the building making industry as a designer, supervisor, developer, or such other kind of a role. The Supreme Court's interpretation, interestingly, severed two aspects. While it recognized that the use of the title of an architect is connected to qualification or registration, so to say, it ruled that the Act does not provide any prohibition on anyone for participating in the building making activity in any capacity. Now, this kind of made a lot of architects uneasy of then what their role is. Although even though architects contribute to a minuscule proportion of the built environment, the architectural community felt threatened, like I said, for its identity and more specifically for its own agency. So just to now kind of recount that, in response to the fresh economic flows of post liberalization, architecture in India after the 90s actually almost willingly took a service oriented tone, molding private capital into bold, unapologetic delivery of absolutely new building types. And the architectural portfolios in the last 3 decades, as we may see, have largely been about second homes, private townships, corporate complexes, or commercial enclaves. To a large extent, these tendencies must also be read as the exigent and inevitable responses to the restructuring of national economy itself after the liberalization period of the 90s. And this has been a clear departure from architects who grew up in the socialist state in providing solutions for large scale affordable housing, city expansions, or public institutions, and such other kind of ideas. The new millennium has not only brought to the fore the difficult realities of the built environment that we have come to inhabit today, those that have created social and spatial polarizations that are sharper and more evident than ever before. And this is particularly evident in the increasing number of protests across the world that are deeply related to access to resources, spatial inequality, or social differences. Through a sustained disengagement in this way, the figure of the architect is now associated with the provision of luxury amenities and servitude to capital rather than addressing the issues of space within the public domain. And in this scenario, architecture seems to have lost its umbilical cord as well as its intellectual ground within contemporary society. And therefore, we believe that this aspect must be called for a deeper inquiry. So it is here that we come to the idea of building agency. Building agency as it's twofold: the building the agency of the architect, as well as to think about the agency of space or the container of space, which is the building. It aims to address the question of how architecture becomes relevant for the society and in the society today. And there are two main dimensions, like I said, to this question. How does spatial design shape societal relationships? And how could a spatial practitioner contribute responsibly and potently to the emerging complexities of spatial operation today? And with that background, in the series of building agency, we'll have uh, 8 fortnightly talks, and you might have you can look at the list of speakers who will speak under this idea and help us expand upon the questions of building agency on our website c.edu.in. But today we are very happy to start our series with a very young and very interesting practice, Chaal Chaal Agency. Chaal Chaal Agency is a design research collaborative project founded by Kriti and Sebastian Trujillo Torres, working between Ahmedabad and Bogota. They specialize in experimental infrastructures, transformative design, and transdisciplinary pedagogy. They are interested in investigating intersections between equality and space. They work between India and Colombia, which allows them to inquire into issues and potentialities particular to the global south, in the prospect of triggering larger transformations through evolving micro operations, which usually involve different kinds of parties like students, allied organizations, proactive communities, and so on. Their practice is envisioned towards a more self-sufficient, equitable, and cohesive, and creating cohesive cultural environments. And so they kind of become very apt to begin our very discussion of building agency. I will invite Kruti and Sebastian now to take over and also talk a little bit about their own background, probably, because otherwise I didn't talk about your backgrounds because it would just make my introduction too long and make you waiting for too long. So I welcome both of you, Kruti and Sebastian, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Anuj, for that introduction. And I think we absolutely appreciate um, the initiative that School of Environment and Architecture is taking to talk about building agency and precisely put that forward as an important topic, especially given the global scenario that we all are in. And we cannot thank you enough that you thought of us to kickstart this conversation. And yeah, I think we could probably very briefly introduce ourselves. So I'm an alum from Academy of Architecture, so that's where I did my bachelor's, and then I went on to do my master's in architectural design at SEPT University. Worked for a couple of years at various architectural offices, and then Sebastian and I met when we were doing our masters, and this both of us realized that we both were interested in trying to understand micro interventions in the city and what that has an impact on. And that sort of kick-started Chaal Chaal Agency, and we started doing a studio at SEPT. And today, after 3 years, we are here.
Yes. I'm an alumni from the Universidad Nacional de Colombia here in Bogota. I worked here for some years, after which I went to do my master's at SEP when I met Kriti. I stayed for some years in Ahmedabad as a professor in SEP itself, and then we started practice, and the rest is history. I think Kriti already sort of explained it quite well. So should we start?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Cool. Thank you so much again.
Thanks. I'll just switch off my camera now.
Yes.
All right. So basically, the idea of today's presentation is to sort of give an insight of, let's say, the basic conceptual background or the theoretical basis by which we work, and also trying to give an insight into the operative dimension of what we are trying to put forward in terms of the overall agenda of what Chaal Chaal Agency tries to achieve. And hence we sort of wanted to put forward this idea of light infrastructures as a way to understand different ways to by which we can sort of speculatively think about development, not necessarily within the conventional trends or the conventional sort of structures by which we usually understand them. In terms of the presentation, we're gonna go through these four main topics. I'm briefly gonna talk about infrastructure as a practice hypothesis. What's the political condition that it entails, how it relates to structural violence, and how this idea of the light space strategy comes about, and how that eventually sort of informs this idea of light infrastructures. I'm also going to be briefly talking about experimentation in relation to informality. That will eventually take me to one of our main axioms, which is or we invent or we err. After which we're going to start talking about our projects that develop to this proposition or this question of how to change the infrastructure without taking power, which is of course this wing to how to change the world without taking power. By which we're going to talk about many of the projects that we've developed so far. So, as many of you might know, or many of you might think of infrastructure, we usually understand this whole topic as the set of systems that make up the functional city, right? Is this sort of set of networks that are entailed or are implicitly embedded with this convoluted set of resources and services that manifest themselves through these more than human constructions that are usually determined or constructed by objective technicians and specialists. I quote objective precisely because this is something that we like to problematize through our practice and through our own research. Precisely what we try to problematize is the way by which we try to identify the manner by which infrastructure usually embeds different forms of political agendas and different forms of let's say, very particularized ways of understanding the environment which are not necessarily as straightforward as they would seem. However, the manner by which we like to understand infrastructure, or the manner by which we've discovered both through our practice and our research, is more as a set of processes, social, material, and technological processes that determine the environment and usually work as these sort of mediators, as mediators of instances of citizenship, but at the same time work as these control mechanisms. When I say instances of citizenship, I mean that by default, there are different levels of citizenship, especially when we're talking about the complexity of the Indian society, right? Wherein those levels of citizenship are determined by different factors. And hence, that sort of idea of citizenship as something that is absolutely by default, but that is kind of determining sort of absolutely the horizontalized line, is not as such, and there's always the different these differentiations that are implicitly correlated to infrastructural systems or infrastructural processes, and hence by these mechanisms of control, you are determining how much of a citizen you are, right? How many rights are you sort of entitled, and how many responsibilities you're sort of set with. On the other side, we're very much interested in the idea of infrastructure because it also becomes the podium of the struggles and negotiation that polarize our cities. And despite of that, is something that is incredibly monopolized by bureaucrats and administrators, and hence this sort of question arises of what is the role of designers and researchers within this environment, given that it's so important. So what do we do within this whole entire complexity? Hence, we sort of arise at this notion that infrastructure has an intrinsically political condition, given that it works as a mediator of power relations between groups or individuals, restricting or facilitating the full potential of life. And hence we can say that infrastructure can be understood as a medium that manifests processes of structural violence. For those that are not aware or are not familiar with the term, is usually it's a term that basically denotes the manner by which certain groups are excluded systematically from the acquisition of certain rights more than resources themselves, right? So it's a way for you to but exclude and hence eventually violent in a very significant manner a particular set of people, which can be executed by absence, precarity, or poor design of infrastructure, given the production of bureaucratic or administrative arbitrariness involved in its management. Silently and extensively, infrastructure plays a very important role as a biopolitical agent, which can be assimilated to conditions of systemic disenfranchisement. So I'm briefly going to walk you through one of the communities that we've worked with in Ahmedabad. This is the community of New Faisal Nagar, which is, as you know, most of you know Gujarat. Then you have Ahmedabad, and for those that know Ahmedabad, you have the Sabarmati River, and on the outskirts of the city, near Chandora Lake, you have this settlement that was created in the 80s, started creating as an informal settlement in the 80s by different contingencies. You have the riots, you have different forms of discrimination that made these communities go to sort of conform this particular settlement. But however, what we wanted to understand about New Faisal Nagar is not necessarily how it manifests these let's say processes of infrastructural violence, but rather what were the different civilian-based or the different everyday conditions that manufactured alternate infrastructural processes and systems that were done precisely outside of the fringes and the control of the state, that were self-managed and so on and so forth, not as a way necessarily to to romanticize poverty, but as a way to encounter or decipher the different mechanisms of everyday citizen inventiveness. Also understanding how infrastructures don't necessarily need to be managed by a centralized authority or a centralized agency. Um, Further on, so basically what we started to do in order to understand these processes and this sort of self-managed way of understanding infrastructures is we started mapping the whole urban layout in order precisely to understand the relationship between identity, spatial conditioning, the movement of resources, exchanges, and so on. So we wanted to understand these intersections and how they manifested by virtue of infrastructure, right? So what was the role of infrastructure within the construction of the city? And hence we started to sort of see the different scales. I'm not gonna go through it in much of detail. Also understanding how this changes across time, not only in terms of the day itself, but also throughout the year. And of course, how that eventually involves different forms of resources like water, electricity, etc., etc. So this eventually took us to what we call light space strategy. So basically, it's a way for us to understand or to sort of put together the different inferences that came from from us observing these forms of urban construction. The light space strategy precisely comes from this overall manifestation of the architectures that take place or the architectures that sort of manifest in the public realm that have very particular conditions. Now, taking forward different theoretical traditions, what we started the way by which we started framing this idea of the light space strategy is precisely as a social phenomenon of appropriation, where space doesn't have an absolute definition in terms of function, form, or temporality, but rather is this stage or this platform of hybridation, right? Is because it's the light space strategy as such is a space of absolute polyfunctionality that is in constant transformation and adaptation to different conditions, either economic, social, political conditions, that allows different accommodations and allows different levels of diversity to be incorporated simultaneously into one specific, into a very open-ended an urban, into a very open-ended urban space. And hence, we like this idea of the light space strategy as this sort of decentralized agency that is not necessarily something that is part of official narratives, but it's something that is constantly sort of going around it and sort of changing position constantly, as something that is not necessarily not something that is truly definable, right? Um, moving on, we also started to see lightness as a state of adaptability, but also as a projective character. In that sense, we wanted to look at it not something as that simply understand it as a research object, as something that is defined within certain conditions from the perspective of investigators, but rather something that has a potential to change or transform the environment and can be sort of geared within the way by which we design our environments from the perspective of architects, urban designers, planners, and so on and so forth. And methodologically, it is closer to playing, given that it presupposes a certain attitude which is challenging but strategic, is based on mockery and humor, but at the same time is based on frugality and patience. And as a design logic, it can be seen as an instrument to intuitively examine, to test, and discover in interaction. In other words, to experiment. Um, in that sense, for us, experimentation or what is experimental is something that makes itself be evident. It's something that is explicitly participant in daily political processes by bursting and transforming them. It's not just a silent sort of formal background, but rather something that is constantly changing the way by which social relationships are constructed. In that way, it seeks to resolve a problem differently beyond the intuitively conditioned. In that sense, it's counterintuitive. While it has risks, that because it has a certain predisposition to failure, the results are not pre-given. For us, it's absolutely indispensable, given that it's the only way to achieve radical transformations. However, we of course want to push that idea of experimentation a little bit further into the realm of what we call, or what Teddy Cruz calls, responsible experimentation. Because given the disciplinary saturation with experimentation, wherein experimentation is usually equated with this formal opulence and with context of absolute privilege. The new paradigm of experimentation is emerging from what is understood as the margins. That is not from the centralized positions of capital and so on, but rather from more diverse fringes that otherwise were neglected. And this new paradigm is thoroughly more comprehensive because it's evidently actively committed to wider issues. It's not just about form, it's not just about solving spatial issues, it's about understanding the different sets of processes that are embedded and sort of weaved within the way by which we understand space and construct it. In that way, we want to understand informality as experimental category. Informality understood as a series of practices that are not guided or necessarily dependent of formal guidelines, but they retain a certain degree of autonomy. Logics of making a city that, although may prescribe tangible and complex problems, are nevertheless conditions to face in our context, and that establish a task not only of experimentation, but of significant categorical invention. And hence this idea of either we invent or we err, that comes from this quote of Simon Rodriguez. For those of you that don't know Simon Rodriguez, he was a very important Venezuelan, let's say, professor. He was the professor of Simon Bolivar. For those of you that don't know Simon Bolivar, he was one of the liberators of the Americas. And Simon Rodriguez in himself had a very, very interesting work, especially dealing with pedagogy. And we're talking about, 400, 500 years ago. 200 years ago. In that sense, he has this very interesting quote that says, ¿Dónde iremos a buscar modelos? La América Española es original, originales han de ser sus instituciones y su gobierno, y originales los medios de fundar uno y otro, o inventamos o erramos. In English is, where will we go finding models? The Spanish America is original. Originals have to be its institutions and its government, and originals have to be the mediums to found one and the other. We either invent or we err. Now, we find this quote fascinating because if we extrapolate these principles from the perspective of the research possibilities that we contain, nowadays, we can start sort of putting forward different conditions, or we can start speculating about different agendas, like, for instance, development as a sustainable process of degrowth, about transitory operations of networks and systems, and adaptable evolutionary design, and hence this idea of live infrastructures as this larger disciplinary agenda that talks about this transformability, about scalability, about changing from the small as something that takes resources as the program, not something that comes eventually, and where people are absolutely central. And when I'm talking about people, I'm talking about the different social and political relations that we build on an everyday. And hence, this sort of takes us to this idea of how to change infrastructure without taking power, that, as I said before, is a wing to John Holloway with his book, How to Change the World Without Taking Power, wherein we find it very interesting, this sort of idea of how how by employing the different relationships that we possess as citizens, we can eventually overtake larger sort of functionings in the society without necessarily taking forward the conventional processes, the conventional violent processes of assuming those positions of decision making. But rather is more about civil organization, is more about non-violent initiatives. And hence, it sort of takes us to the different initiatives themselves that we've been taking forward. The first one that we wanted to bring was the Astai Shala. This was a proposition for a school in Goa, a school of craft in Goa. Astai Shala basically means the makeshift school. Basically, is an institution that constructs by virtue of the relationship between professors, students, administrative body, and the city around, by which the different modules of the architectural program are sort of, are built in a way that they can sort of adapt to different circumstances as a game, where you have different pieces, and those different pieces can be accommodated in accordance to a particular set of rules. Hence, despite the fact that the school doesn't have a particular site, because we didn't think of it as something that can be established in one particular, contextual background, but rather it can sort of change in accordance to the necessities or the availabilities of space and so on. And we also try to push that into the realm of material conditioning. That is, that you can sort of construct the school in accordance to whatever resources you have available to you. Also in regards to the technologies, the sort of labor that you possess, and eventually the idea was to think or imagine the manner by which we can think this sort of thinking or this sort of teaching or learning platforms as something that is completely horizontal, that has this sort of intrinsic relation to the environment and to let's say, the environmental qualities around it. And of course, thinking of it as something that has this continuous dialogue with the natural features around it. We eventually started constructing a model. This was before, before one of these larger disappointments where you don't get to construct the building and so on. But it's what we started doing here is to try to understand what are the actual conditions of light and so on, and also thinking about the manner by which the user relates to the building, right? So the model in itself sort of assume this position or this character of the game. So basically, whomever was involved with the building itself could sort of transform it, could change the manner by which the modules are disposed, how the modules come together, what is the relationship between the pieces, how the pieces have a certain characteristic in terms of the overall environmental character, and so on and so forth. So as you see here, the model in itself represented that that attitude of having the user determining the spatial and architectural features. That also is related to one of the projects that we proposed for the rejuvenation of the Buckingham Canal in Chennai. So basically, this was part of a competition that sort of entailed, let's say, a way to relook at the canal as something that was not just a place where you can throw garbage and just whatever, but rather something that is actively participant in the life of citizens, right? And so basically, the competition proposed, let's say, an urban design sort of initiative, however, what we wanted to do is, so basically, sorry, I'll start from the beginning. Basically, what we started to do is to inquire about the actual conditions of the canal, when we started to see the different projects that already exist and that are embedded in the institution itself. So what we sort of, the conclusion that we came to is that despite the canal already follows a very conventional way by which we understand and construct our cities, right? So we imagine these huge changes, but those changes are sort of kept in some archive and are sort of utilized for certain political means, right? So what we wanted to do is, instead of proposing another project that will be stacked somewhere in the mayor's office, what we wanted to do is to completely change the way by which citizens relate to the canal, not necessarily from the perspective of urban design as it's conventionally understood, but rather from more up from the perspective of the activists. And hence, we came up with this idea of occupy the canal. So the idea was to propose these devices that would run around the canal with this basically transporting information in such a way that not only they would manifest the possible futures of the canal that were indebted to the citizens as such, but also it will work as a research center that would parallel in a parallel way would work as a way to sort of push institutions and push the, let's say, the administrative bodies to execute those projects that were in line, right? So instead of thinking, from the perspective of, let's reimagine completely how these eventual futures can be, we set up the stage by which citizens themselves can push towards those futures and reinvent them themselves. And hence this sort of idea of the movable architectural object that, of course, is in reference also to these chariots that are very particular to South Indian architecture. And of course, you might know, for those of you that have been to Chennai, is a very straightforward quote to the chariot of the main temple of Chennai, which is a fascinating form of understanding temple architecture, because what it does is that it brings the god and brings this sort of sacred message that is embedded in this secluded architecture into the city, right? It makes it into an entire event. And we wanted to reproduce that mechanic by virtue of this different form of architecture that would sort of, appropriate different urban sceneries where people could not only interact, but also have this different set of events, like, open exhibitions, community spaces, also as a research facility, and so on, and street performances, and so on and so forth. So basically, instead of thinking as another sort of dreamed, future for the city, we thought we thought of the mechanisms by which citizens could push towards those changes. This relates eventually to a project that we are currently trying to develop here in Bogota. This is I say trying to develop because it's, with the pandemic, it became extremely hard to push it forward. But anyways, the project basically is this movable community center that is set in this community in San Cristobal Sur, which is in the southern part of Bogota. What you see here is a map of Bogota. You have the mountains in this portion, and then you have this settlement right here. Now, what is interesting about the settlement is that it sort of manifests these sort of conventional ways by which the larger metropolitan areas were constructed, where we have the history of political unrest and the guerrillas and so on and so forth, that eventually produce this immense influx of immigrants that were basically displaced people that came from the fringes or from the rural areas of the country into the capital seeking protection, because of political persecution and so on. And usually displaced people, constructed informal settlements in the fringes of the city, like in this case, which in this particular case of San Cristobal, basically it has a lot to do. Was very closely related to many of the guerrillas, like the M19 in the 1980s. and some say that the takeover of the palace justice in the 1980s was planned from here, but I'm not going to go through it. However, what is interesting about this community is in itself this sort of drive to put together self-managed and self-constructed processes without the reliance of the state. And hence, since the 80s, they have been constructed these sort of right to be in their territories and the right to construct their own livable conditions. And we were fascinated by these initiatives, and we wanted to support them by sort of going through the same notion of having this self-managed movable infrastructure that could be placed wherever they wanted. So because always settling in a particular place has a lot of issues when you sort of when you base yourself in one particular space, then you have a certain compromise, or you have a certain visibility towards the state that tends to respond in a violent manner. Hence, we wanted to propose this movable device that will comprise different elements within it. So basically, you have different furnitures that are sort of collapsed and are sort of stored inside, but eventually the element itself can expand as this sort of urban facility that would have not only a library and a center for exchange of goods that are being produced in the neighborhood itself, but also a set of library units, these sort of tables for workshops or whatever. And that eventually would sort of, and we were also very paying a lot of attention to the manner by which this was constructed with them, the particular materials that are familiar to them in terms of their technologies and so on and so forth, and how it sort of moves throughout the settlement, right? This is, for us, is very, very important, how it sort of is not fixated into a particular place, but rather it's an urban facility that can have different factions or can be manifested in different sites. Further on, this also relates to one of our first experiments, which is the Applicability, which comes from a larger investigation on informal vending in Ahmedabad and how we can sort of try to push those devices forward, not only as places for vending, but also as these assets that increment the quality of the city, the quality of social relationships, and the quality of the urban space in itself. Also understanding it as a eventual device for emergency housing and so on. So what we started to do is that after this set of investigations and observations, we tried to do certain innovations in terms of the material quality and so on. Also trying to understand how the device develops throughout the day, what are the different facets that it has in terms of its urban quality, and how it eventually constructs the city, right? Is this sort of this urban building, that this urban architecture that is sort of constructed by agency of smaller pieces that are self-managed by civilian agencies. We also try to put that project forward in different situations. In this case, it's in Saatari, and eventually we got to construct a prototype, which was for us extremely valuable because evidently we got to understand many aspects of the way by which we can move it, the way by which it's installed, the different services that it can provide, considering the particular conditions, in this case of Ahmedabad. So understanding the weight of the device, the way by which people react to it, the scale that it has, the way by which it relates to its immediate sort of surroundings and so on. For us, it was an incredible learning experience. So, yes.
Okay, so I'll take you all through the next set of projects very quickly as well. Taking from what Sebastian is talking about, we also try to experiment with the idea of accessibility and not fixating certain devices to a particular place. And we came up with something. So both of us were very fascinated with this little device called the Kavadh, which is it comes from Rajasthan, and it is a very particularly fascinating device because it talks, or it brings the temple to the people who are not allowed within the temple. So it kind of is a solution that was come up with the people who are not allowed within the temple, and then how that sort of device also can capture their own personal narratives, or can capture certain portions of the Ramayana or the Mahabharata that they closely related to. So for us, that was a very fascinating device that allowed the agency of narratives within the hand of the people that had the device itself. So then we came up with, and this was, I think, in 2018, when we were doing this studio at CEP University called Play Methodologies, and as part of the end semester exhibition, we precisely wanted to sort of move away from these panels that you usually would pin up all the student work, but rather look at this device as a way that by which people who come to visit the exhibition can eventually change the facades to kind of have their own narrative. Eventually, this we also invited the community, that is the women and the men of New Faisal Nagar, where the research was based out of, to come and engage with the work that the students had done. So you can see here that this sort of closing and opening of the box is something that was left to the people to kind of move around and change based on how they wanted to engage with the device. Um, this eventually led to Sebastian and me kind of, so if you see all the work that we've done till now, they were all very experimental, more idea based kind of work. And then eventually both of us felt like, no, we need to sort of take this out and manifest our ideas and try and see what it actually does. Because when we both are doing studios and in the academic realm, it's very easy to sort of ideate. So we kind of self-initiated this project, which we call the Pani Lari, or the water cart, and it is again based in the same environment as New Faisal Nagar. So that's another thing that both of us wanted to sort of give back. After researching for a couple of years in the settlement, and we realized that because water was one of the key issues in the area, we felt like the mobile water filtering unit, which is also a public device, and it is also a device that creates an urban space within this kind of settlement, and creates a platform for the engagement of the people, for them to gather. And we felt like this sort of initiative was something that nobody was going to sort of think of right now, especially in conditions like this. So we kind of tried to raise the funds, we got the funds, and we started to build the project itself. And it has been quite a learning curve for both of us, because we realized that with projects like this, with such experimental projects, also come a lot of difficulties in trying to collaborate with a lot of different people that make part of the whole process of design itself. And we learned a lot from the people that engaged with us through the whole project. Eventually, we also collaborated with people who had the sort of technical knowledge of how do you install the water filtering units and so on. So there was a lot of I think for both of us, we realized that there was certain limitations to how much we can do as designers or as architects, but eventually the project was developed with the involvement of external agencies. This eventually led, so the previous project that we did, we were trying to implement it on ground with this NGO called Center for Development. And through them, we came across this group of women in the Valmiki community in Ahmedabad. They live in this staff quarters called Behrampura. And the woman that you see here in red, that's Pushpa Ben. And what for us was absolutely as we also learned a lot about the aspirations of the women in this particular community, wherein they, as you can see here, they kind of self-initiated these classes for basic learning, writing, and reading skills, because they felt like they were at a disadvantage because they didn't know how to read even numbers or letters in Gujarati, which Even something like basic, like, reading the number of the bus that was coming, they felt it very difficult. And therefore they created this initiative that looked at empowering them in these sort of basic skills that should have been part of their life. So the lady that you see here is Ankita Ben, and she's one of the youngest women there, and the only one who is pursuing her further studies in BCom. And she volunteered to conduct these classes every evening for the women on the terrace. As you can see here, what the environment by which these classes were conducted is very basic. They kind of sit on the floor. You have this little blackboard, and that's about it. But as we started speaking to the women, they told us a lot of things about feeling insecure, not feeling safe while they were part of these classes, essentially because the neighboring terraces usually would have men, and therefore the women would be would have to put on the veil on their head, and that's very inconvenient when they are studying. So therefore, we then were trying to think of a way by which we can transform that space and take forward the idea of the classroom from a more infrastructural point of view. And we came up with this project, which is the Gyan Ashray, which we constructed with the students of SEPT University. Some of the key things about the project is that, one, how do you construct the different pieces of the project such that it can easily be hoisted onto the terrace itself. But also, one of the things was that the staff quarters was very old, the quality of construction was not good, so there was no possibility for us to anchor the structure onto the existing building. And therefore then we were trying to look at various ways by which the structure can be on wheels on the terrace, can be placed quite easily, but also gives that sort of flexibility to the women to kind of close it down and open it based on their kind of need and use. Which was also another thing that the women told us, is that they would like to have that sort of independency to close down the classroom when it is not in use, because they were very worried that other people would kind of take over the space and so on. So like you can see, so one of the things like I mentioned earlier, which was we took clues from sort of the veil of the saris, to then how do you translate that into this very lightweight structure that that has these fabrics that are wrapped around it, and to kind of give that sort of sense of security, but also to give that sort of porosity within the structure itself. Another thing that we kind of introduced into the project was also this these solar lights that could be hung in the structure, because one other realization that we had is that the women were restricted, or the class timings were restricted based on the, of course, the amount of natural light that was available. So therefore, this kind of transformed or increased the timing of the use of this entire structure. Another thing that we kind of kept in mind here was that the entire fabric structure that you see here, which is the canvas that is on top, which is waterproof, so it protects from the rain, which is pretty rare in Ahmedabad. But also the colorful fabrics that we used was done locally with the tailors, and was done in a way that can be easily maintained by the women, and therefore it removes us from the quotient, from the longevity of the entire building, and how it can be adapted and changed by the women itself. Um, so yeah, so this was sort of the day that we inaugurated the entire structure, and since then the notion or the function of the structure has changed drastically. In about 2 months, we saw that it went beyond being a classroom, and it became the space that became the identity of the women, became a space that became the community space for meetings, was the space where NGOs and the women met, and also where became a space for the children, where workshops started to take place. And we, I think for us, this project was something that not only created a very unique identity to the space of women, but also was trying to take a lot of clues from its own context. So the colors, the fabrics, and so on. So something that we've always realized with our own projects is that we deal with very small scale interventions, and something that we've always wanted to think of is precisely how does that small scale intervention have sort of larger impacts in the urban realm and in public space itself. So this was another project that we did with two other colleagues of ours, Hugo and Pablo, and we were trying to experiment with the idea of how can game boards become that sort of tool to engage the public in the process of public space making. And we took Manik Chowk, which is a very dynamic space in the middle of the old city of Ahmedabad. It is a space that completely changes from the morning being a parking lot to the night being this very vibrant, very active food or this sort of cow gully kind of a scenario. So then what we were trying to do is that, okay, if you have such a complex urban system and you have multiple stakeholders that change not only through the year or through the days, but also through within the day itself, then how do you make sure that the voices of all the different stakeholders are heard, and then the public space reflects precisely those voices. So we came up with this sort of board game that included these the toolkit, which you can see on the left side here. So we came up with these small urban elements that make part of the public space, and which we call the toolkit, and then the toolkit become the pieces of the board game, and then eventually we imagine this as multiple sessions that could be played with the various stakeholders, and as a way to document all of the different opinions, suggestions, and voices of them. Eventually, we also pushed that idea forward into the Streets for People challenge that was conducted in the various cities across India, which was part of the Smart City mission. And we took part in the Streets for People challenge in Chandigarh, wherein we had the Sector 15 V4 road, and something that we realized with Chandigarh, and of course, the way by which Lee Cobb had conceptualized the whole city is that the roads were the places for the cars, and the entire city was designed for cars, but the people were sort of left on the fringes. And what happened over time is that the cars took over most of the streets. So then how do you sort of reclaim the street for people? Especially in a place like Chandigarh, where there are already multiple parks, there are plazas, but all of these spaces were becoming parking lots. So what we were trying to do is then eventually trying to identify through tactical urbanism methods, the different formats or strategies by which we can connect the different plazas and give back the street to the people. So again, we took forward the idea of the toolkit. So you can see there are various small pieces that make the urban element. So you have things, very small pieces like the step bench, you have moving planters, you have a moving bench, you have pieces for playing, and so on and so forth. So the different ways or the strategies by which we went about this is you cannot make transformative change immediately. So like Sebastian was saying with the whole Occupy the Canal project, that is, urban design thinks of the scenario, researches it, and then proposes this radical transformation within the scenario. But we precisely wanted to break down that transformation and look at it as something that can be done through phases rather than everything done at a time. So you start by very basic things like just traffic cones and ropes to demarcate the spaces, so by which you can change the behavior by which people park their cars or where people can walk. Eventually you also start to give you claim the traffic, or you claim the spaces that usually would be for the traffic. Then you introduce the tactical toolkit. So you introduce the pieces that make part of the public realm, And eventually these pieces can double up to activate that public space. So eventually, as you can see here, you see that the entire plaza that is dominated by cars can transform radically and through faces into this space for the people. So yeah, I think I can move forward. Lastly, I think we just want to talk about our own academic endeavor, which we have been pursuing for the last year and a half, which we call Unit Light Infrastructure. And this is the work from one of the semesters that we've taken. And this was particularly a very interesting design brief that we set up, wherein the students had to design and implement something that we call the pad lari, which was essentially a lari that made available sanitary and hygiene products to the women of the settlement of New Fazil Nagar. And for us, it was a particularly interesting journey that we took through the semester, because the students firstly tried to understand the role of the women in the society, the spaces that were used by the women, which essentially was the internal streets itself, and that became the extension of their public space. So eventually, how do you take clues from what is existing to transform that into this mobile device that not only can be functional, wherein it makes door-to-door availability of sanitary products, but also becomes this platform for the women. So eventually, for us, it was very important that both of us always stress on, is that we have to realize our own limitations as designers. So we always collaborate and bring into the whole process of design the agencies that make part of the everyday working of the community. So we usually have volunteers or a particular kind of NGO, the community leaders who make part of the design discussions itself. And eventually, for us, it was very important to try and understand the different materials that are available, or the different kind of local experts, such as welders, fabricators, that are available within the community. So you can capitalize on the community itself to build these devices, and eventually we extrapolated that into a construction manual, wherein we were also trying to question the idea of working drawings, because what we realized with our engagement with fabricators is that they don't tend to understand the drawings that we feel very proud of, and we basically wanted to break down that sort of notion of working drawings and put that into a more accessible manual, which eventually would help us have a conversation rather than put us in this position of the experts. And this was just a little animation video that the student had put, which very beautifully captures what something as small as this sort of mobile cycle lari can do to the environment and the community itself. So yeah, I think that's the end of our presentation. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. I must congratulate Chaal Chaal Agency on all the experiments that you've been able to do, execute, and also project in the future. I just was constantly making a lot of notes as you were, presenting your work, and I've just collected a few things to kind of maybe discuss with you. But before that, I want to really put down 3 points which struck out in your work. One is that all your work and your practice very successfully challenges the classical European canon of architecture, which is established around this idea of firmitas, venustas, utilitas, which is this whole idea of durability of architecture, that it has to be permanent. And I think one very big takeaway from your work was that it completely dismantles that idea that architecture needs to be permanent in that sense. The second is that, which I really kind of enjoyed, is that it brings a new value to the idea of infrastructure. And I like the link that you made between infrastructure and power, and how it makes us citizens in some sense, and it makes us responsible. How infrastructure makes us responsible, and that link that you revealed was quite interesting. And I thought that your work brings a new value, and kind of in some sense tries to reconstitute that idea of responsibility and power through the reworking of infrastructure itself, and kind of you know thinking of infrastructure itself as the material of intervention in architecture. And third is a more in a more contemporary kind of sense, it completely challenges the image of development that we hold in our eyes. Development in particularly in the global south is always trying to match up to these standards of developed economies, and trying to build bigger and bigger, and without really closely understanding the implications it has on society per se, and the kind of segregations and disparities it brings in society. So these kind of micro interventions that you experiment with really break down the image of development that we have. And with that kind of prefacing of your practice, I had a few kind of you know suggestions to not suggestions ideas to discuss with you and ask you. One is that in some sense your practice gives us a hint of you know uh, of a way in which architectural practice itself needs to reconstitute in some sense, because there's a huge component of going out in the community, mapping the community, talking to a lot of people and understanding things from their perspective, which completely inverts in some sense the traditional role of the architect, where the architect was the person who was the chief person who would direct people on the site. But here it's kind of bringing a new dynamic into the whole constitution organization of the practice itself, where probably we need to you're suggesting, your practice is suggesting that we need to have a kind of capacity within our practices to be able to engage and understand people. So I wanted to ask you, how do you go about mapping issues? How do you go about mapping and talking to people and identifying uh, the significant things that you would like to address through your design process?
So, usually what we do is, I think the initial 1 year we didn't know how to. I think we were also in that same trope that, we come as the experts and we want to talk to you as the expert, and what we say is more or less right. So, it kind of took us time to break that notion down as well. And we also realized that for us, one of the key learnings was to first acknowledge that we were outsiders. We don't understand what they go through on an everyday basis, and it is our responsibility to first understand that before we say that okay, this is what we should do. And for us to do that, so for us, it was first important to build the trust.
Mm.
And to build that trust, usually what we would do is that we would either try and engage with the NGO that has been working for years, who already have established a trust
Yeah.
within uh, that sort of neighborhood. Or we would try and identify a community leader, try and have more conversations with him or her,
Yeah.
and then through them, in like they would introduce us into the community, and for us that has been a very successful approach. And then eventually, once we know people there, and then when we sort of walk through, it's very easy to kind of have conversations.
Yeah.
But it's very important to first break that sort of barrier.
Yeah, I think additionally from that, I'm very glad that you used that word mapping, because that's precisely
Mhm.
what we try to do, and because mapping entails not only the tracing of the existing elements that exist in an urban or an infrastructural layout, that is, whatever you can observe out of that environment in a in a straightforward manner, but it also entails, to a large degree, on the one side, making visible or surfacing the different relations or mechanics or dynamics that exist in the place that
Mm.
are not evident. And on the other hand, it also entails reinventing those processes, because you're
Mm.
sort of
Yeah.
selecting which information.
Yeah.
So in that sense, we're not acting as bureaucrats that are simply sort of, you know, bringing that one information into another realm that is eventually, acting as direct translators of what people want,
Mm.
because we also try to, step away from that position of being that sort of, from that populist position that you
Right.
simply, translate into design whatever people want. You also need to work as an intermediary, because
Yeah.
you also are an agency that understand other realms of knowledge, and within that realm, you are capable of understanding that what will come in the future, how
Mm.
that relates to other realms and
Yeah.
other dynamics and so on. So in that sense, we for our position in that matter always very straightforward. Not straightforward. It's always very clear, in the
Mm.
sense that we always work as an agency that assesses a situation
Mm.
and tries to support that initiative or that social process, political, situation,
Yeah.
uh, by trying to potentialize those the possible spaces that can be withdrawn from them. And by
Yeah.
spaces, I don't mean just simply the physical layout,
Yeah.
but also the different relationships that can be
Correct.
constructed.
Yeah. Yeah.
In that sense, for us, mapping is a structural way by which we understand a scenario, where
Right.
it's also trying to withdraw specific dynamics and trying to reconfigure them by visualizing them in specific ways.
Right.
Uh, and henceforward, we as an agency that assesses a situation and assesses through the perspective of potentializing infrastructures or systems or whatever. We withdraw ourselves from the position of the saviors of the people that come with the truth, that come as as this sort of
Sure.
because in that sense, for us, it's very clear that we identify something that is valuable, and then we try to potentialize it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That
Uh,
way, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Before I move on to my next two questions, I would like to invite our audiences to put their ideas, questions in the Q&A box here while we kind of continue to discuss a few more things together. In continuation to your earlier comment and my earlier question, I wanted to ask that what kind of re-articulations of knowledge in language does it take to be able to look at things from the community perspective? Like, I mean, what I mean to ask is that we are trained in an academic language of architecture, and when you go in the field, you really need to rework that completely. And I just want to ask your experience from the field, and instances or any such anecdotes that you have, which really gave you an insight into that you needed to rework your knowledge systems and language to be able to think afresh.
I think one of the, and I'm guessing this is like the obvious one, but which is this sort of we versus them kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is something that we have taken some time to sort of disconnect from.
Yeah.
But so what we then try and do is then we start saying like we use hum kya kar sakte. So we try and make ourselves part of the we.
Correct.
And make, like, basically both parties need to be part of the same wheel.
Right.
So that is something that we try and do consciously. And we also try, most of our students, like, that is something that we first, like, don't go saying that, it's us and then you and this and that. So we that's the first thing. The second thing, what I think the other thing that has helped us bring forward their sort of opinions is also trying to look at it from, I think, the game board perspective. Because what we have learned, so one incident that comes to my mind is that there was a particular game board that was designed to talk about the relationships between the borewell owner and the person who's receiving water, and they happen to be in the same session.
Okay.
And it kind of triggered conversations between her and him that usually she would not be able to say to him. So that is another sort of facilitation that we thought was important. Like, how do you get this sort of conversations going?
Right.
Uh,
So the game became a mediator of facilitating difficult conversations
yes.
between the parties who are at stake.
Right. Yeah. And then we put ourselves in that role of the facilitators,
Right.
and that's about it. And then we became observers, and we take down notes of the conversations after that point.
Yeah, I think in many ways that re-articulation has a lot to do with this sort of role that we try to assume, which is the role of the hacker. So the hacker is someone that departs from the everyday as something that is, seemingly banal, but we try to tap into the ethics and the aesthetics of that place from that everyday, the contingencies of everyday. And by hacking into those, we hack by agency of not only interacting, but try to change certain elements by way of that same interaction. I think that's the way that, and usually we utilize these sort of devices because they become they become props to facilitate those hackings.
Right.
Those hackings are usually tend to be very subtle, very as a hacking is,
Yeah.
to be something that not something that takes place in a larger scale that sort of puts you in a particular position, but rather is more silent.
The second domain of question I had was regarding the kind of structure of the material, like the tectonics of your projects itself, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the economy of collapsibles that you play around with. And what I wanted to really understand was, and this is a question that is lingering in my mind since some time, that there is an architectural way of putting together things with certain kinds of movements, fittings, and forms, and that's how we are trained to think of things in the way they collapse, in the way they open, in the way they close, and so on. Whereas oftentimes the way in which the locals kind of approach the same thing could be so very different, and it can sometimes add a playful dimension, and it can sometimes also be clumsy. But I wanted to understand, because a lot of your experiments feel very articulate also in the architectural sense, and I just wanted to ask you that were there moments where there were things that you came to revisit through the traditional ways in which people do things on site, because I mean, like the way in which uh, the neatness of the whole thing is quite an architectural thing, and I'm wondering that, is it an architectural obsession, or does it ever give away to the, because I feel that that neatness also cleans up the creases of the tensions in some sense between the different politics that is embedded in the material of the form itself. And so I'm just kind of interested in finding that, how do you work around that? Are there things that you take from the community which are not really resolved to the architect's eye, but you still kind of are able to think of it productively in your design processes?
Yeah, so I think from the perspective of the larger disciplinary view of Chaal Chaal, we do find very problematic this fetish with precision and this fetish with these exquisite details.
Yeah.
Because that can only be manufactured in context of certain level of privilege.
Right.
And that is something that usually it becomes a fetish, is an irrational fixation with an image that
Right.
doesn't necessarily translate into conditions of use, of durability, and so on and so on. It ends up something to satisfy the architect or the architects, right? And to sort of show up.
Yeah.
Which we find that kind of absurd, especially when you're in a context of scarcity, in a context of that you have different priorities, right? And hence this idea of experimenting with architecture as an architecture of error, an architecture that allows error to happen and allows error to be incorporated into the functionings of the device, as something that allows people to eventually correct or seemingly understand that error as something that can be modulated and can eventually evolve. In that sense, we from that perspective, that whole idea of these collapsible architectures is something that for us is very straightforward. Is something that is in evolution. It's something that is a start. Something that is meant to be appropriate, is something to be changed, or something to be dismantled and reused as material pieces. We also need to understand that especially in the Indian context, that's a very prevalent thing, that structures are constructed for 1,000 years. Not only the structures are constructed for very specific time-bound events, but also the way by which they function are time-based rather than place-based. So in that sense, error needs to be incorporated as a way for you to negotiate those conditions of time versus place.
And how does error take form in your projects?
So
or does it? or you?
It does, because I'll talk of with the example of Pani Lari. I think that was a project of errors, complete errors. We had this sort of vision, we had a design, we thought, especially I mean, if you notice the roof that sort of is pulled up, we thought, okay, there is a way to do it. We had a notion of how to do it. And then once the project was built and it completely collapsed, and we're like, oh my God, we don't know what to do. We couldn't think of a solution. It took about 2 weeks for us to figure out a way to actually put or spring up that roof and bring it down in a way that was easy for anybody. And it didn't, and that's when we realized it just wasn't both of us, but we had to bring in another fabricator who had the sort of knowledge, and he along with us, we tried and finally fixed it, and it was done in this complete jugaad manner, like complete jugaad, like we put like external pieces and whatnot, and we somehow got through it. Also, the sort of hinging mechanism to rotate the whole roof, we hadn't thought it through. That was something that we did on the go, like with the fabricators and the welders, and we fabricated these small pieces that we put together. So I think, that whole project was done in that manner.
And I think in many ways, this whole notion of the architecture of error and the architecture of failure. Yes. I think most of our projects have been failures.
No, I think you're being too harsh on yourself. but no, I understand that, and I think what I also meant by how error takes form is to not kind of let everything be neat and clean, but allow these errors to become a part of design themselves.
And the notion of the aesthetics of the ad hoc, of the aesthetics of the addition, and something that can be intervened and can be changed and so on.
Yeah. And the last point, and I'll open it to the audience. I was very intrigued by the last project that you showed, where you were talking about the creation of a new public realm. And in that context, I was just kind of wondering that, how do you then allow these kind of light, dissolvable, dismantleable, moving infrastructures to be claimed again by society, by the community, in the sense that because it is the claiming in some sense that constitutes power. And so how do you reimagine the production of this new public realm and the reconstitution of power through your interventions?
I think that's precisely where because it's these small elements, or it's elements that can move around.
Mhm.
We're hoping that it will be claimed. It'll disappear also, and that is what I think will create that power in some sense.
Yeah, I think the manner in which we look at this creation of a new public realm also comes precisely from the way by which you think from the micro, from the way by which you think of detailing. So if you build something, so you're sort of saying that this element is meant to be, like that forever. It's something that has to acquire the shape, and it's acquiring the shape, but it's not eventually decomposing into something else. Whilst if you think of something of a structure that is bolted, as something that is sort of set together by by virtue of your own mechanical strength, then there's something that eventually can be, you know, dismounted, right? So if you think of infrastructure as something that is not fixed, as something that is completely done, that is finished, but rather, if you think of infrastructure as something that is unfinished, that is something that has certain space for improvisation, for certain space for you to act upon it, then we have a completely different city, right? Because you, as a civilian, as an everyday person, you're intervening into your environment and you're changing it actively. There are certain degrees of discussions and negotiations and and conversations that will be entailed in the construction of that reality. Not necessarily that something that is completely done and that is sort of has this sort of condition of prohibition from the perspective of the state, but rather as something that the state is constructed by virtue of their own citizens, actively participating. So we're not submissive receptors to larger decisions, but rather we're actively participants into the way by which things work, the way by which things are not working, right? So if the city that is not working is also because it is also my fault. I cannot blame the government, and but rather it's because I did something wrong, and we do need to do something about it. So there's also a condition of responsibility in that sense. So in that manner, there's not this vertical condition of power where you're sort of establishing infrastructure from above, and then that's it. But rather it's constructed more in a more transversal way, where things are incomplete and you're always trying to sort of push them a little bit forward as an everyday person.
And that kind of sorry, you're saying
Sorry,
something.
no, I was just saying that which already happens in our context.
Of course.
Yeah.
Just that we see it with a negative
Yeah,
face. We see it as something that is,
Yeah.
and we don't see the value in it and how we can capitalize on that.
Yeah. And just leading on to now the question, but I really like the point that you made on this idea of the incompleteness. And I still feel that your structures in the formal sense look very complete, but if they also have that element of incompleteness, the community will be able to kind of keep on morphing it as they go along, and it makes something else completely out of it also. And I think that's a possibility which could also allow people to claim that this thing as an infrastructure for themselves and keep evolving. I will now kind of take the questions that we have. Prasad actually wants to make a comment. If I can request Dipti to help us get Prasad on the panel, it'll be really nice. Prasad, you're on mute.
Thanks, Kriti, thanks, Sebastian. I mean, so nice to kind of start the series with your works actually, and also thinking through the idea of agency, your practice as agency, as well as your process as agency, the form that emerges out of your practice, that as agency. So I think it has been a wonderful kind of start for this series actually. I mean, two or three things to share basically, not as questions as such. One is the sense of property, like in the sense that uh, uh, architecture brings about a sense of property. It gives I mean, even uh, in its non-permanent state, even in its transient, even in its non-resistive state, it kind of brings about a sense of property. There is a claim that kind of gets a form, and then that kind of starts belonging to somebody, and then when there is a sense of property in the city, then it starts uh, the, then all the other dimensions of property, which is about renting it and subletting it, and inheriting it and mortgaging it and selling it, all of those dimensions of property become active. And that object or the form, which starts off gathering its forces from impermanent things, and with very fluxy flowing kind of energies, that starts getting settling because of the property notion. So this is something which we've been thinking about since quite some time. Typically, uh, you see that in Bombay, you set up a lorry, and the lorry has two wheels, but then over time they settle, and then with the wheels they kind of start subletting it, some parts of it kind of and then it becomes a. I don't have a problem in this kind of claim, but this is it consolidates. This is the beginning of property regimes. So that is one dimension I want to think through. Second one is the idea of process, in a sense that the process of design, like modern ways of putting things together, is there is a studio work that happens. There is a studio work that happens with lots of drawings and experiments and models, and the process that happens in self-built projects gives very little space for the studio work, because the mobilizations of material, of funds, of people are different, in the sense that you suddenly find somebody throwing their furniture, and you want to kind of get it, and you don't have a space to keep it, but you need to kind of quickly get a carpenter to fix it up. So this addition to your spatiality, to your form, is incumbent on that person throwing the furniture, you kind of being able to get it, and you kind of, and then also to also getting a carpenter who will apply her own or their own kind of thinking into the making of the what into. And here the studio work is not there almost. It is so negotiated, it is so kind of and you all are working in that realm. In many ways you all are working in that realm where the finances, the mobilizations, all of it is not so clear and not so permanent and not so fixed. So then, because the studio culture or studio ways of doing things require a certain permanence, a certain kind of base from where it should emerge. Then how does how should it what should be the process of thinking, and where what should the design be, where design should be located? I think it can be located a little bit before the objects, before the objects that get created, maybe in some institutional form, some processes, etc. So these are the two comments I mean that's because we were also thinking very close to how y'all are thinking, and this is where we are at our work. So I thought I will share with you these things. Yeah, that's all.
No, I mean, I think it's very valuable. I think it gives us a lot to think about, especially this whole notion of the phase in which the object arises, or the phase or the moment in which the product emerges in terms of the studio processes. And I think for us precisely that's always kind of a challenge, no? Because we're as architects we have this inherent inertia to produce beautiful objects quite quickly, right? And to try to force them into certain situations. But I think something that we have precisely learned is how do we prioritize contingencies and how do we prioritize circumstances that can directly inform the way by which the object forms almost automatically. So we're sort of like, in between an agency of that works in between contingencies and circumstances and a design object. So we're always trying to negotiate both. And it's always sort of a struggle for us to again fight those inertias of our own education and our own background, where we try to predefine many things and we try to uh, work certain products or certain certain results preemptively, and so we always have to fight ourselves against those sort of preconceived mechanisms, those preconceived methodologies. So yeah, I think the way by which you think that studio culture and the mechanisms and the dynamics of the studio are are a constant. I mean, for us is we have to constantly be checking on ourselves. So yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks.
I'll exit.
Thank
Thanks.
There's a question from Jasmine Nilani Joseph from Sri Lanka. She's asking, when you choose the place to locate and create the structure or the vehicular space, do you consciously think about the heritage and historical value of the place? What are your challenges? What are the challenges you face working with the local communities in a limited and active space?
Oh, that's a loaded question.
Yeah.
Breaking into parts. So I think that the first one is in regards to the
Yeah.
how to respond to these conditions of heritage and history and so on. I think that's an excellent question, especially in a context of South Asia, right? Where you're a stone throw away from millennial heritage, and you always have the inherent responsibility to respond to that. However, I think the manner by which we always try to sort of deal with these conditions is not necessarily by mimesis, is not necessarily by mimicking. Usually the again these sort of inertias that we have inbuilt is to sort of reproduce formalisms, right? Is to sort of reproduce forms, and that's the way by which we think we are continuing certain traditions, or we're sort of showing a certain respect to a historical context or whatever. However, the manner by which we try to evaluate that is the relevance of certain elements of certain aesthetics and ethics in a place and how that manifests in more immediate architectures. I made myself a little bit clearer. So instead of reproducing or mimicking those formalisms, what we do is try to examine what are the elements that are more present in an everyday basis, because sometimes we tend to overstate history as something that is that cuts across, but rather we need to understand history as something that is more, in many ways, more immediate. It's something that it is manifested in a more everyday manner, right? It's manifested by the way that we communicate, in our gestures, in our in the immaterial culture that we, the immaterial heritage that we possess. So what we try to do is that we try to prioritize those elements that are relevant in the everyday niches of our culture, and try to materialize them. We try to sort of manifest them. Of course, we try to pick clues here and there from
Yeah.
those more historical formalisms and whatever.
Yeah.
But so you have
No, I was just saying that it's also to look at what kind of history, because whose history, because there are a lot of undocumented histories. Because, for example, we have the history of these markets that pop up and go away, but perhaps they're not documented. Or even, for example, I think informal commerce or mobile carts, and they have a large historical context to themselves. So we try and also look at that, and not go by the sort of popular narrative of what history is, or which history is significant.
Yeah, I think that's also a huge challenge to understand what is the history that you're giving preeminence, or what are the narratives that you believe are more relevant in a specific time or context, and how that's playing to a particular politics. So, and I think that's a conscious decision, because history is not a pre-given. History is also constructed. History also has biases. History has also particular agendas behind it. So I think understanding those narratives and plugging into particular narratives, or particular ways of thinking history, I think that in itself is the first exercise, rather than automatically reproducing the tropes of certain historic backgrounds. Or
that's a very interesting idea that you brought in, the history of the impermanent. I think Jasmine was also probably referring to the subtle and very beautiful gestures you made in your buildings regarding, the veil, or the cowards, or the raths in South India. And I think these tropes kind of come in a very subtle way. And that was, I think, very beautiful about all the projects, of invoking history, and also at the same time making or pulling it out in the public realm, and throwing it back in the public realm, which was quite interesting. There's a question by Rupali, and she's asking that what is the role of drawing in the architecture of ad hoc or the improvisation?
That's also a loaded question. I think that, but it's a very interesting one, because for us, drawing is I mean, this is kind of again an architectural inertia, but for us, drawing is fundamental. Not only as a way of manifesting certain ideas, but also as a way to sort of predispose certain conditions. So in that sense, we see our drawings, or the way that we draw, as this sort of what we call retroactive scores. So, or this in a larger scale, these sort of scores that are meant to be performed, rather than the exact reproduction of an object that has very precise dimensions and so on. We like to understand the drawings as certain directions towards movements and manifestations and gestures and exchanges and so on, that will eventually produce something. But in that sense, our drawings try to be a little bit more open-ended in that sense.
But I think more than our drawings, our models capture that sort of ad hoc improvisations that we would like to bring in, and that's when the models help more than the drawings, I feel.
True.
Yeah.
Thanks. There's another question by one of the students, Jatan Gala. He says, thank you for the amazing presentation and articulation of the relation of infrastructure and everyday. He asks, if infrastructures are looked as tools of appropriation, and building of a common public space, then what happens to the idea of module? What is it a really module of? When does something emerge as a module? The idea of a module becomes a deduction of something, and can urban practices be afforded in a deductive module? Okay, I think I hope you got the question.
Yeah, more or less. So I think, um, I mean, if Jatan, if I'm understanding your question, what I see, what I see, what you're trying to say is that you see that is problematic, this idea of the module as something that eventually sort of, in a very preemptive manner, tries to homogenize
Mm.
a very heterogeneous landscape. I think that's more or less what I don't know if
Yeah,
what it is.
I think that's what
I think what he's
I
yeah, I think what he's trying to say is that a module is a singular kind of object, whereas the public is what you rightly said as a homogeneous thing. And how do we reconcile this kind of contrariness of the formal articulation of something and the homogeneity of the condition?
Right.
I think, Jatin, I think perhaps to answer your question, we can look at our immediate context right away. Like we don't even have to look at any of our designs, but let's say that we look at the basic cart, the four-wheel cart. It is a module and it is replicated almost everywhere in India, but it still creates a lot of heterogeneous nature because each person who takes that module makes it theirs and completely changes it. So I may add certain things to it. I may add an umbrella. I may add something else, whatever. But then I completely adapt it. So it may start as a module, but it will completely change with time.
Yeah, I think the key here is to understand that one of the most interesting conditions of Indian urbanity is precisely the fact that it is constructed within this notion of how an object is easily translated into a landscape. That is, for instance, the example of the Lari. So a Lari, which is a seemingly homogeneous module that is seemingly, that seemingly reproduces, it actually is quite diverse and is quite sensitive to the different contexts and situations that exist in every, let's say, more stable conditions in the urban realm, right? So in that sense, modularity as something that is incomplete and something that accommodates to specific circumstances is a dynamic that already exists in the context. On the other hand, if you look at the idea of a module or a piece that is trying to address larger problems, or so let's say, if you try to look at urban design as something that is simply looking at the piece instead of looking at the tree instead of looking at the forest, then that's something that also already exists in the conditions urban dynamics of India, right? Where many of our infrastructural systems are conformed by virtue of pieces that reproduce, assemble, and relate in very diverse manners. So if we think of Indian urbanity from the same epistemological perspective as in the West, that you think urban design as, you have large streets, you have certain systems, boulevards, whatever, then you're thinking it. I believe that we will be thinking it in the wrong manner, because the principles, the values, and the properties of Indian urbanity are completely different and are vastly more complex. And you cannot simply simplify them on the same condition of, to solve a market, then I make a boulevard, right? To make some public space, then I make an open plaza, right? So we cannot utilize simply this job so immediately, because then we find the problems that we have today. So if we make an open plaza, then we have encroachment, then we have issues of garbage, etc., etc. So if you have a boulevard, then you have, right? So instead of thinking from the perspective of pre-established solutions that we need to implement in order to advance ourselves, then you're thinking from the perspective of the way by which things are supposed to be. But if you think of from the properties that exist already in the environment, and you try to capitalize on the behaviors, dynamics, and elements that already exist in the urban layout, and then you try to push them, then you have a completely different result, because then you'll be working with the contingencies as such and not as you want them to be, not trying to negate them. That's also the sort of larger agenda that we're trying to push through. Sort of think of urban design in India or in the global south from the contingencies that they deserve, and not from preemptive sort of cookie cutter models.
Yeah, I think Jatin, just to kind of extend from them, you are basically asking how does the Lari become the landscape? And I think the Lari becomes the landscape precisely in its quality to disappear, and disappear through the attributes of its movement, its collapsibility, and precisely being light. And I think that's what their project is about, that it's about the lightness which makes it's not it doesn't fixate this into a module, but rather it allows it to dissolve into the landscape. So I think we have addressed all the questions that were raised in this session from the audience, and we have also kind of reached our time, and very much in time. So I really thank both of you to bring your experiments and discuss with us so passionately all these aspects that we precisely wanted to hit upon through these series of lectures. So thank you so much, Kriti and Sebastian. We wish you all the best with your practice, and we really look forward to the new experiments that you introduce into the environment. So thank you. I would like to, yeah,
Thank you so much.
thanks. I would like to thank all the audiences, all the people in the audience who made time to participate in the discussion. Our next session of Building Agency will happen on 9th July, that is 15 days from now, 14 days from now. And we'll be talking to Matter from Goa, that is an organization started by Rudraj Parekh along with his colleagues. And please join us in the second session on a Friday fortnight later. So thank you so much, and see you.
Thank you. Take
Thanks.
care.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.